Thank you for watching us here at Tax Talk UK, where we talk about all things tax and try to help you to navigate the tax system as it applies to you. Today, we're going to be talking about late filing penalties for self-assessment. Before I do, if you haven't already, please do take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel. That way you'll easily be able to refer back to the information if you should need to, as well as being able to find other information that we have available on a whole host of different topics, all aimed at helping you to navigate the tax system. And if you navigate to the playlist section of our YouTube channel, you will find all of our information loosely catalogued into the playlist to help you to find the information that's most relevant to you. So back then to late filing penalties for self-assessment. So if you have received a penalty for a late filing of self-assessment, then the first thing to consider is why did you receive this? So for example, was it because that you needed to submit a self-assessment tax return and you didn't submit that by the filing date? In which case it's important that you act as soon as possible to get that self-assessment tax return submitted. So it may be that by the time that you receive the penalty notice, you have already submitted your tax return. If you haven't, then you should act as soon as possible to do this. So the first penalty of the current system, you will receive £100 penalty, but that isn't the end of the penalty system for self-assessment tax return. So if you just simply think, well, I've had my penalty now, there's no rush to do this, then you will be in for a shock because the penalty system kicks in, and after a certain amount of time, you will start receiving daily penalties. You will receive further penalties at other key times of being late, and ultimately, if you haven't submitted your self-assessment tax return within a year of the deadline, your penalties will have arisen of £1,600. So it's certainly not wise to just think that you've had a penalty and so the pressure's off. If you, by the time you have your penalty, if you haven't submitted your tax return, then you certainly need to get on and do that, because as I say, that initial penalty won't stop there. So the next thing is to consider, have you received a penalty for late filing, but you don't believe that you needed to submit a self-assessment tax return? Now, we have talked about this in other videos. If you are issued a notice to submit a self-assessment tax return, then you do need to take action. You need to either submit your self-assessment tax return. If you don't believe that you do need to submit a self-assessment tax return, then you need to let HMRC know why you don't believe that you need to submit a tax return and have that notice cancelled. Now, that is wise in any case, because if HMRC think that you need to submit a self-assessment tax return and you don't tell them that you don't, then they're always going to think that you need to submit it. And so the same will happen the next year. So sometimes that penalty notice can be the sort of first prompt that you've missed a notice if you don't need to file one. So if you don't need to file a tax return and you've received a penalty, then you will need to contact HMRC to tell them that you don't need to submit one, and ask them to consider filing that notice. That is at their discretion. If they don't, then you will still need to submit that tax return. And the same as before, if you don't take any action, then the penalties will accumulate up to, as I say, the current system means that once a tax return is 1 year late, then you will have incurred penalties of £1,600. So then the next thing to say is that so you've received this penalty or these penalties. And is there any payment to make too? Because there's a separate system for late payment penalties. So if you don't file your return, you will be penalised for filing it late. If there's some liability and you don't pay it, then again, there will be penalties for that, which is separate. So it's important also that if you do need to submit a return and you're submitting it late, that you also pay any liability. And we won't go into it in detail here because I talk about it in other videos. But if you are unable to pay your tax and you contact HMRC before the payment deadline, then they will consider a payment plan. And if that is put in place, that will at least prevent penalties for late payment. So if you are in the situation that you're not able to pay, again, taking action is going to save you in penalties. So let's have a scenario where you did need to submit a return, or you didn't need to submit a return, but you've received this penalty and you think that you have a reasonable excuse. Now, if you don't need to submit a return, you may consider that to be your reasonable excuse. But there is an appeal process where you can appeal a penalty. Again, there's time limits of when you can do this, and your penalty notice will tell you how that you can do this. Basically, what you need to do is truthfully and honestly explain to HMRC what happened in your words. If applicable, what measures you've put in place to make sure that your returns in future aren't late, and they will then consider. So there's no hard and fast rule of what HMRC will consider a reasonable excuse, because each appeal is considered on its own merit. So as I say, the way to approach it, if you feel that you have a reasonable excuse, is to go through the appeal process. It's quite simple. If you really can't manage it, you could write a letter to the self-assessment helpline, but obviously that takes a lot longer. So it is better to follow the correct appeal process if technologically you're able to do so. HMRC would be looking at extreme reasons, that those are generally what they would consider reasonable excuses. So so sort of simple things, and especially if you have a track record of submitting returns late, that is also something that HMRC would take into account when they're considering your appeal. So somebody with a unblemished record of submitting their returns online over a large number of years may have something considered reasonable, where somebody who's sporadic about submitting their returns on time, HMRC may consider in that case that it's not reasonable. So the point is, if you consider you have a reasonable excuse, then you can explain that to HMRC in an honest and accurate way, and they will consider whether they agree with you and whether that they will quash that penalty or not. Unfortunately, if not, then you will need to pay the penalty, ideally by the deadline. But again, the same as any liabilities that's due, if you can't make the payment by the deadline you've been given, contact HMRC to ask them to organise a payment plan. So everything these days, of course, the penalty system is in place to make sure that people are meeting the deadlines, because obviously without that, it would be that there would be a lot less incentive for some people to be meeting those. So it's important that there is a penalty system in place, and it has been adapted over time to try to all work to encouraging you that if you can't meet a deadline, if you can't meet a payment deadline, that you contact HMRC, rather than just either burying your head in the sand and just thinking it will go away. It won't go away. So if you have received a penalty, notice that you do need to take action. So just to recap, the first thing is to consider why you've received that notice, and if you have remedied the actual thing that caused the penalty. So if it's a late return, that you get that return submitted as soon as possible. If you didn't submit because you didn't believe that you needed to, that you contact HMRC and ask them to withdraw the notice. Sometimes they won't after the deadline. But as I say, there's no hard and fast rule. So if you feel that something's not right, then contact HMRC, let them know, and they will work with you to resolve that. If the penalty is justified and you feel that you've got a reasonable excuse of why the situation arose, that meant that you received that penalty, then follow the appeals process. But remember that there are time limits on when you can do that. If you find the penalty system too difficult to navigate, which obviously everybody is different, but just write a letter to HMRC, and just explain, as I say, it's important that you're honest and accurate in your account of what happened and what led to the situation. But the worst thing to do is to just ignore, because the penalties will increase. So you need to take some action. So penalties are never nice to receive, but as I say, hopefully this helps you to understand what you will need to do. Firstly, to make sure that the penalties don't escalate, and secondly, to reassure you that if you do have a genuine reason, that you can ask HMRC to consider that. Thank you very much for watching, and if you haven't already, please do subscribe to the channel, and good luck. Thank you. Bye.